You are the happiness you seek. Week 7. Week 7 here with J-Dog. How you feeling about that echo?
Like a separate self.
It's pretty bad on my side, actually. Can you like turn your volume down on the computer, see if that changes anything?
Oh, you don't want to join my fucking misery?
No, I don't want to be a part of this echo, this separate self.
I put it down to where I can appropriately hear us on Zoom. That's all I can tell you.
Hey, man, we're just going to do what we can do. All right, everybody, welcome wherever you're watching, either on YouTube or Instagram Live. We are back here again on week 7 of our book club, You Are the Happiness You Seek by Rupert Spira. This is a banger of a chapter, man. We're getting into chapter 12. You ready for this?
I sure hope so.
You're probably not ready because you're eating food, right?
Well, I needed some beef. Actually, it's not beef; it's lamb today. So, a little grass-fed, grass-finished lamb.
Cool. We'll see if it allows any greater thinking to occur within you. So chapter 12 is called "Who Is It That Suffers?" Right now, it's Jason because of the echo on his side. So he's the one suffering. But aside from that, the quote at the top, which I will read this week, is by Rumi. And the quote is, "Let yourself be silently drawn by the stronger pull of what you really love."
So why do you like it?
To me, when in love with something, I don't believe there needs to be an efforting. I think that the draw is happening itself, and it's quiet, it's silent, and it's strong. What do you think of that? What do you think of that?
It's one of many potential interpretations, for sure.
And very likely the best one ever have taken place.
That's hard to beat. That's hard to debate that. It might be true.
Yeah. All right, man. So let's get into this chapter. This is probably the only chapter we're going to do today because it's pretty meaty. I have a lot of notes. In the first page section, he begins to talk about physical versus emotional hurt.
Yep.
And I guess what I wanted to point out and play with in this is to notice yourself offended by verbal affliction. Right? Somebody has come at you, they've demeaned your character, they said something that triggered you. You obviously recognize that this is not physically harming your body. But what he's getting at here is that if you see that it is not physically harming your body, then what is it that is actually getting hurt? What is feeling this suffering? Who is it that is upset? And what I believe he's getting to recognize is that that person, that thing that is getting upset by this offense that you've received verbally, is an illusory self, an illusory entity, something that you've created to get hurt. Well, maybe you didn't consciously create it to get hurt, but it has been created by you in some way, which creates your hurt.
Is this a natural pause? Do you feel complete, my friend?
Yeah, I guess the next part is just, how when that illusory entity is triggered in some way, how there is a seeking of relief in either objects, activities, substances, circumstances, or relationships. And that way of addressing the hurt is not going to actually solve the hurt. But rather, what he's offering is we address this hurt by asking ourselves what I asked earlier is, who is it right now that is hurt? Is it my physical body? No. What is it? And not really pay much attention to the words, the things that were said, but reflect the mirror back to us.
For me, I really like, if we're going to categorize and use an approach, I really enjoy the fact that he has mentioned in other areas that physical pain is to the body what emotional suffering is to the mind. And I really like that in a sense. On some one level, I like the distinction. And then on another level, they can be merged, which we can get into. And to piggyback on my experience of what he's saying here is that anything that is naturally has a physical pain or a discomfort, that is distinctly different from psychological suffering. And he doesn't use the word pain in relationship to, like some people will say, I'm going through a lot of emotional pain. Sometimes I've done my own self-inquiry in such a way to say, I've learned that when people, well, when I used to use it and when others, I feel like use it, they're referring to believing in potentially the idea that there is a such thing called psychological pain. And I know that in and of itself might be could be triggering and challenging to some people.
Oh yeah.
But the idea is that, as you were sharing, is if you were to consider the next emotion that you have and ask yourself just in a very simple way, does this emotion have pain or does it carry pain? And I would challenge anyone to really, rather than face value, respond with yes or no, just go deeper into it and experience whether an emotion of anger or sad or joy actually has any physical pain properties associated with it. And I think if you do that with thoughts, sensations in the body, you've come to realize that emotional states and bodily sensations all too often don't have any quote unquote actual pain associated with them. And I like that delineation because it sets the tone of how you identify what's going on in my life and what's the root source of what's going on for me. And that therefore, if you can identify the root cause, then you have the possibility to identify root solutions. And if we don't get to the root cause, then we're just playing whack-a-mole with a hope and a wing and a prayer that somehow my suffering is going to go away. So I think that's really super important, and is a little bit of a paradigm shift maybe for some. It was for me when I read it a couple of years ago. And that's also for me to acknowledge the fact that, yes, if I have an interpretation about what someone says, does it produce a biochemical reaction in the body and adrenaline or cortisol is released? Yes, it does. But when we look at it, that does not undermine still the delineation between physical pain and psychological suffering that we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's not to deny the content of that experience, the experience itself, but it is, where is that taking place? For whom is that taking place?
Yes, and that's super tricky, Tyler. So like when the first time you heard about this, who is this self? Because I can only imagine if someone's listening to this, they'll be like, Tyler, what the fuck? Maybe they might be saying, what the fuck are you talking about who is the one that is experiencing psychological suffering? Like, how did you experience that the first time you read it or heard it, or I don't know. And then secondly is how are you feeling about it as a result of reading this chapter?
I feel the first time I heard it. I feel like it's an easier concept to think about than it is to feel. To feel into what I really am is a practice. But it is constantly practiced by asking the simple question of who am I? What am I? To whom is this experience taking place for? But so it's just, again, always asking myself those things when, and I've been implementing that a lot lately. When I do get triggered, who's triggered right now? What's triggered right now? So now I feel like it's just a really great diffusing practice for sinking into what I really am more often, more easily. Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to offer from that first page? I covered a lot of it, but anything that stuck out?
Yeah, I'm just going to put in a plug to piggyback on what you just shared. For me, what was important to learn is, for me, what you're getting at is, when we identify who or what we are based upon the construct of a personality or our body, that is the introduction of our ego, our separate self, which leads to, by default, suffering, psychological suffering in this context. The questions that you were asking remind me of the questions that allow us to kind of untangle ourselves from identifying with our personality, our ideas or constructs, as well as associating ourselves with our body, so that it allows us to come back to our essential nature that is not, quote unquote, personality or the body. That our essential nature, I guess I could say, manifests in this world through the use of a body. So it has a body, it has experiencing of emotions and sensations, but fundamentally, it is not which comes and goes. So I just think that is sometimes lost in translation. So when you're saying how I'm reminding myself what you're sharing about the illusory self, or etc., to me, that's what it is. It's when we believe that, we have this, we're bypassing our essential nature for the notion that I'm a personality, that I'm these beliefs, I'm these ideas, I'm these stories. And I think that, to me, I don't know, I'm throwing it out there because I know that I had to wrestle with this for years sometimes, with trying to understand the construct and understand it, which I feel pretty solid about now, at least I perceive so. So just trying to help connect dots for anyone who might be listening, and also probably hear myself talk to myself one more time about it.
Release those constructs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. So that, to me, is the first page. It really sets the tone for the rest of this damn chapter, which is pretty interesting, to say the least.
Definitely, yeah. On the next page, I appreciate his reflection about the difference in what he's offering versus what the Buddha offered. He describes the Four Noble Truths, which state that there is suffering, it has a cause, there is the possibility of its ending, and there is a means by which this may be accomplished. In what Rupert is teaching, he restates it in the affirmative statements of there is happiness, it is our true nature, it may be easily found, and there's a simple and direct path to it. I do like that reframe.
Amen, brother. So to your point, I literally put in my book, I enjoy that. I enjoy that delineation of how he phrased that. So yeah, piggybacking on what you're sharing.
I just think there's, I mean, obviously it's very related to what this whole book is about, but just the statement of the affirmative side of what the work is necessary, in my opinion. And if you're thinking about like manifestation, Abraham Hicks stuff, it's like, don't focus on the suffering in the healing of the suffering, because that will perpetuate the idea of the suffering and the vibration of it. So it's kind of a positive manifestation way of looking at what this work really is.
Okay.
Okay. On that note. So moving on to that second section, the activity of the ego.
Made reference, I apologize, Tyler. Go
ahead.
I just made reference, like, I think it's helpful. On page 77, I made a note for myself about how the ego is defined. And I like his little twist to it in regards to using the word a separate self, because prior to that, I used to personally confuse myself between what is the mind and what is the ego. And for whatever reason, his introduction or his language seemed to solve that riddle for me pretty fast. So basically, he says that the ego or the separate self could be defined as the identification of self, of our self-awareness, meaning that our nature is awareness, that happiness that you were just talking about. But when we identify ourselves with the content of experience, or the mixture of awareness with the limited qualities of the mind and the body. So I really appreciated that, because to me, it solidified thoughts and ideas of what I've read and considered, which is that the mind is just the activity of consciousness. It functions, it just thinks, it just perceives, almost like, I'll just say the analogy of a computer. It's just doing its processing. Let me say it that way. It's just being it's just doing its thing. To me, that always felt different than the ego from a belief, constructs, interpretations, etc. concepts. So I like the delineation between the mental activity that one does, which is a byproduct of its functioning, versus the ego, which is a belief that I am separate from my connection and being and my amness or my consciousness, with in exchanging that knowing with the belief that I'm a separate self, and I have that I'm limited to the mind, and how the mind, well, I'd say the personality and the body. So I don't know, throwing that out there for get your take on that, or how you've handled that in the past yourself.
So you're just referring to how he's talking about this, the ego, the separate self, being the thing that is the activity of the consciousness, like the going outward, the looking outward, the moving outward, the retrieving, and all of that.
I think what I'm trying to say is that there's a difference between the mind, fundamentally the mind, as we think about planning, thinking, sequential. It generates thoughts, it generates ideas, it generates memory, it generates all kinds of things. For me, it is taking thought and then blending it. The ego, that's different from the ego. And for me, the ego is to take that thought and to misappropriate it for one's being as one's essential nature.
Hmm. That's interesting to consider.
Because for me, at the end of the day, the ego is just, as if I go back to the top of page 77, the ego or separate self could be defined as the
Well,
identification with the content of experience, or a mixture of awareness with the limited qualities of the mind and the body.
yeah, I mean, I I would say, well, why is the mind needing to think thoughts?
I would say that
Why is the mind needing to plan?
um, I would say for me, the mind plans relative to like practical purposes. Like if unless we didn't, if we didn't use our mind, we wouldn't fucking be meeting right now. So there's a practical application of how to coordinate and plan something, etc. That to me is a function of the mind. Whereas the ego, if I perceive myself as a separate individual personality from you, and I interpret all of our interactions through that perspective that I am separate from Tyler, then to me, that is where it introduces the concept of discord and disharmony, or uncomfortable, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say it's all ego, honestly. I think that based on what I think I know, what I've heard about, those that reach enlightenment, there is no doing. There is
Yeah.
literally no doing, right? Like there, people have thought to have those that have reached enlightenment as dying, like they're just not moving, like they're defecating on themselves, they're sitting, they're not eating, there's no doing, there's no planning, there's no talking, there's no rationalizing, there's no ideas, there's no thoughts. So if that is the ultimate state of happiness, awareness, presence, there doesn't need to be anything else. So maybe the mind is just the description of the activity of the ego. We're calling the activity of the ego mind.
Yeah, I would challenge that, because I don't think the mind and the ego are one and the same. I feel like for me, the mind is the activity of consciousness, but it's not where the it identifies itself in a constricted manner associated with the functioning of the mind and the body. To me, it's an identification piece. It's a belief. It's a belief in the idea that I am the mind and the body. So, for example, if someone says, I am great, I am stupid, that person's an asshole, there is this, those are just thoughts. They come and they go. They have, to me, they mean nothing until they get sticky, and as such, it's through this stickiness that occurs because one has a belief, or there is a belief that I am those thoughts. And I think the metaphor of clouds coming and going is another good metaphor to consider. I mean, they're just clouds. It means nothing until we make an interpretation about them relative to our being. So, for example, a lot of clouds in the sky absolutely mean nothing. But for some people, clouds in the sky mean, well, the day is shitty. There's no sun. And if I can't get sun, etc. Or people will say, Jason, you live in Seattle, it must suck during the winter because it rains so much. So that to me is identifying the clouds with a belief or an idea versus it's just overcast. It actually means nothing, because the next person could say, I enjoy the overcast. I enjoy the rain. It's refreshing. It has a unique smell. I have, yada, yada, whatever they wanted to.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. You're talking about the ego difference being that there's an identification with the thought, the thing, whatever, and seeing itself as seeing itself as something other than its natural source. I guess what I'm, I think, well, yeah, I'm definitely going to chalk it up to agree to disagree here. But in general, I still believe that because the mind is of doing, it is not of being. And whatever is not of being is ego.
But how is the mind not be part of the being? It's just
The mind,
yeah.
exactly. A function means it's a doing. To have
Why does it have, well, we can get tossed up on concepts here or terminology. So what's your definition then of being versus doing? Because at the end of the day, for me, an activity doesn't make it doing, therefore make it ego.
I think that there is a reason for the activity is happening for a reason, and the reason of it not believing that it can just be on its own.
Okay, but I'm trying to nail down the idea that I'm interpreting what you're saying is that activity is synonymous with ego. So like if you read the Tao Te Ching, that would be counter to what you're saying, at least as I understand it, right? So you're flowing with the Tao, right? I mean, there's activity, but the activity when you're, quote, in flow with the Tao, so to speak, there's activity, but it's not egoically classified as such.
Yeah, so you're kind of speaking of like Zen in general, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, think of your physiology. I mean, it's an activity of the body, right? So to me, thinking, just pure thought, just thoughts come, thoughts go. To me, it's just an activity. They don't, for me, that's why I'm throwing out there that activity is not synonymous with ego. For me, it is the identification of what that activity means as if I am a separate self, as if to say, I'm going to take ownership of that thought. Those thoughts are my thoughts, and that's what I believe to be true. To me,
yeah, I'm
that's
saying,
the introduction.
why is that activity even happening? That's what I'm like.
Yeah.
Why did that happen anyways?
Well, that's a separate question, but we can maybe hammer that one out. But I'm just trying to be clear, like, is activity synonymous with ego? And throwing it back at you to consider that, for me, no. It is the identification with the activity as being me that is the ego.
Okay. And what I'm saying is that activity, at least in this moment, I'm saying that activity is a part of ego. I was going to say something else, but
what do you mean by activity is part of ego?
Or the like any activity is happening as a result of ego.
Okay. Are you saying then that, okay, well, what I would interpret, there's two ways to maybe delineate this is, there inherently is just the activity of the mind that is benign, let's just say. It just functions with popping up thoughts, ideas, memories, visuals, etc.
That's assuming that anything in the world is benign, though, when there could in fact be meaning behind those benign thoughts.
Okay, well, you have to assume that, but that is a big assumption that there is meaning. I mean, the concept that there is meaning to life is in and of itself, we have not proven that concept, right? So, okay, so if we just take it at face value, okay. All I'm just trying to say is, to delineate what I'm trying to interpret how you're looking at this is that for me, there has to be only, for now, two options. One, there is activity that is neutral, benign, like thoughts come, thoughts go. The breeze comes, the breeze goes, synonymous, if you will. And then as a result, then and those activities are they're just doings. And then there's activities or doings that are rooted in when one believes themselves to be a separate self, I may take action or dwell on thoughts and cling to these ideas. And that quote activity to me is a byproduct of one's egoic psychological structure, where there's a perceived activity.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. All right.
I don't know if there's another way that I want to reframe it. But I'm going to sit on this and I'll come back to you with a little bit more of an elaborate description of what I'm thinking.
Okay.
I think it's a really interesting thing that we just played with, though.
Yeah.
So yeah, in that section on page 92, where he's talking about the activity of the ego, kind of what we've been talking about, the way he describes it, and what I really appreciate, and he talks a lot about seeking here, he says that seeking is the means by which the ego attempts to restore its innate wholeness. So in looking for anything, for some reason, we're choosing things that are meant to make us feel a little bit more whole, right? So, and that is obviously sometimes out of our awareness. So when the ego, for whatever reason, decides you're going to be into mountain biking, you're seeking to become skillful at mountain biking. For some reason, your ego has chosen that that is going to be an activity or thing that you're going to do to allow itself to feel a little bit more whole and complete, for which the ultimate goal is happiness, even though we don't really know that that is happening for the sake of our wholeness and therefore happiness.
I'm going to bust your chops because I'm just in that mood. So I would say is that mountain biking has nothing to do with the ego fundamentally in and of itself. I would say is if you're choosing mountain biking because you love doing it and you're not necessarily doing it for any outcome and etc., that to me is a beautiful, playful activity for an individual. To me, if I'm biking to get my ass in shape because I feel shame of being out of shape, or if I feel like if I become a biker, it allows me to disconnect from dealing with life, that to me then would be egoic activity with a mountain bike. Like to me, it's the, as he says, it's the seeking and resisting of what's going on in life. And then what are the activities, if I'm choosing the mountain biking out of seeking to arrive at some destination to feel better, or that I'm resisting the present moment and I choose mountain biking, that to me is, if you want to call it the red flag, the egoic flag. So I think there's a difference between the two. Just
I can appreciate that. Again, I don't know if I agree with you.
That's okay.
Yeah, no, it's totally fine with me. We're just gonna have one of those days.
Well, yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not. I mean, I feel like fundamentally it kind of comes down to our disagreement that we've had, like in some way. It's identification versus just the doing. Like your argument is, ego is identifying as a separate self, seeing things as not a part of me. I'm saying that even if we don't know it, that the doing here is the ego trying to acquire more wholeness. So you get what I'm saying? Like for you, it's about identification and separation. For me, it's about ego is doing, whether it knows it or not, to do some completion of what we feel is not wholeness. Does that make sense to you? Does that feel like it's actually what our disagreement is?
Okay, so my interpretation is that you're saying that any and all activity from a human being by default is going to be ego. And I would not, in part, I wouldn't disagree that all of our behaviors are by default rooted in seeking and resisting life. So all of that is pretty comprehensive, and that all doing is coming, if it's coming from that place, then yes, it's all ego. I agree. What I am suggesting is that the ability to let go of our personality, our perspective, our attachments is the difference. I'm just delineating the difference, that mental activity and thinking fundamentally is benign. The ego captures, it seduces. The ego is used as a mechanism to steal the benign nature of thoughts, identify with those thoughts, and then takes action as a result of those thoughts, or perceives that it's taking action on behalf of those thoughts. So, well, no, it's taking action on behalf of its ego, not its behavior. So to me, that's different. That's subtly maybe different or not, I don't know. Because at the end of the day, it's kind of like the conversation we've had in the past where, as a helper, or me as an improver, like if I'm trying to improve something because I see myself as imperfect, that's the embodiment of seeking and resisting what's going on within me. So I try to improve myself, others, and everything around me so that I can feel better about the imperfections that I have about myself and others. Mm-hmm. That's one pathway. The other option is if I'm looking to make improvements, but I'm not doing it because of resistance and seeking.
The fact, what do you mean though? Anything, you just said improvements. To improve means to not acknowledge the perfection of what already is.
So if I know that I am already perfect, right? If I know that there is no separation, if I know that I am complete and I don't need any external activities to complete me, from the outsider looking in, I could be doing what is perceived as improvement activity, but I'm not doing it from the perspective that I'm trying to fill my cup with it. I'm not codependent with it anymore, is I guess what I'm getting at. I'm just sharing my knowledge or sharing what I've accumulated in understanding or what I'm capable. I can help someone move. I'm a big guy, so I can help someone move their furniture into a truck and help them alleviate, the execution of them trying to move. I've done that several times with friends, right? If I'm doing that for the purposes of resisting and trying to improve them and improve the situation as if I'm going to get something out of it, that to me is egoic based. If I'm sharing out of the kindness, quote unquote, kindness of my heart with not having any attachments to the outcome, I'm just there to help. That to me is a very different perspective. So maybe said in another way, Tyler, you're a type 2, right? So your big compensation pattern is helping. So the idea simply would be is, are you helping to get something in return? I.e. affirming, feeling validated, feeling worthy, right? Not feeling rejected. Or are you helping out of the kindness of your heart, so to speak, and you're not seeking any of those external validations because you are sharing what's already in your heart to share without any strings attached.
And who's determining the why of sharing?
I mean, I think that's the person's own individual journey. They can self-assess and self-inquire.
Yeah, I mean, so the big thing that comes up for me is like there's got to be something that motivates the externalization of the content of which you're sharing, right? What is that motivation? And so it's interesting to see that in regards to why there is a sharing, whether or not ego is attached to that and how it is or isn't, because you're just saying that, assuming that we're coming from a wholehearted place, who's deciding that? to create the reason for sharing. What I think would be an egoless place of sharing is that the origination of the share comes from those that are seeking it from the one they think can share it. You know what I'm saying? So like the only time I share is when you ask me to. The teacher teaches when someone asks that they teach. It is a direct response to something that is not complete, or feeling that it's not complete.
Okay. I don't. What are you getting at?
I'm saying that you were talking about like, how are you sharing? How can you share from a place that is not with ego? And you're saying that you can share from a place that's not from ego if you're not attached to the outcome and not driven from a place of lack. And what I'm saying is that an egoless share is one that is requested by something outside of the entity, the person, the thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would respectfully disagree. I don't think ego. I don't think it's a prerequisite for someone to say, "Can you share?" To me, it is, you can offer, "Hey, I'm more than happy to help." For example, if you need any help, please let me know, and this is how I can show up. They might say no, or they might say yes. So I don't subscribe to the idea that external to oneself and only waiting till one is invited is synonymous with doing it from one's own heart.
Yeah. Something that I really like in this perspective is David Hawkins' work. I brought him up many times. It's kind of a tricky point. Like what he describes as the work to be done for the world is only the work that you need to do within yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't need to go share anything. Nothing. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's no activism, there's no fighting, there's no changing, there's no sharing. It's literally just you and yourself, and that vibration is actually what creates the effect. So yeah, I'm saying that, and agree to disagree again if that's the case. I don't think that I think when you're at a place of no ego, you don't need to do anything.
I would even argue that you don't have to do anything even with your ego. I mean, to me, that's the fundamental premise of Rupert's work, in my interpretation, is that the notion that you have to do something is the illusion.
Yeah. And he gets to that point. I appreciate that kind of segue into that. Even feeling like, I don't know where that is, even feeling like what you need to do something about your ego is your ego thinking that it needs to fight itself or eliminate itself.
I fundamentally would agree with that one.
Which is hilarious in the world of seeking and spiritual development, right? How many times have you heard, how do I get rid of my ego?
Or the whole idea around higher self and lower self and all of these different things. Yeah, I mean, I can appreciate all of that. Totally. I think there's one part here in that paragraph that you were reading that may or may not be helpful. The ego is not an entity. What says, you referred to this first sentence, I'll just read it again. Thus, seeking and resisting, desire and fear are the two main activities that define the separate self or the ego. In fact, the ego is not an entity that seeks and resists. It is the very activity of seeking and resisting. So seeking and resisting are not what the separate self does. They are what the separate self is. They are the activity that inevitably attends the belief that we are temporary and finite self.
Yeah, I love that section.
Yeah. So I mean, for me, that's it's really important and powerful.
Very. Yeah, I mean, it can be very simple, people. If you're watching and there is inherently a resistance to anything in your experience, or a desire within you to go somewhere, do something, feel something, that is your ego, right? And ask yourself, why? What am I afraid of here, really? And what do I need here, really? And who is the one that's needing or afraid of these things?
So can mental activity occur outside of that paradigm that you just laid out?
No.
You don't think so? Okay.
I'm enjoying the dance. Okay, so
yeah, I find it fascinating that you don't see at all the function of the mind to be independent from the ego.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll explore that more for myself, for sure. I mean, I will challenge myself in that. All right, we'll never get through this chapter, but we're gonna move on to page 93. So let's see. Yeah, I mean, again, just thinking about the seeking. What are you seeking? Like, what are you grasping for? What are you looking for? What do you need aside from food and nourishment? The section on 93 where he says whether it does so by seeking objects, substances, activities, circumstances, and relationships, or whether it is engaged in the same search via religious or spiritual means, it is, meaning the ego, without knowing it, responding to gravitational pull of happiness within its own being. So all of these things are what our separate self believe that is going to bring us closer to our essential nature, which is happiness. It is deluded in thinking that it's actually about those things, though. It's not really about those things. It's those things are the window into the sensation and realization of what happiness is. So let's say I snort some Coke real quick, and I get this great dopamine rush and I'm loving life. It's so good. That little Coke bump was a window into what my essential nature is. My ego thinks that is the answer, but what it really is that window into what I really am, which is the experience of happiness and completeness. So people, if you're doing Coke, it's not wrong. It's just a little bit of a diluted window.
I love it.
There's just a little quote that I think is worth sharing. It's by Hafez, and it says, "Ever since happiness heard your name, it has been running through the streets trying to find you." So what I think that means is when you experience, and something I was actually going to challenge you with, but this might take too long, is, do you think this is where I was like, fuck, should we go this deep? This essential happiness, like when happiness heard your name, my thought was, okay, Jason, when did happiness first hear your name? I'm thinking about this for myself. Maybe happiness first heard my name when I'm a content little child, like, I'm sucking on mom's nip, or maybe it's the womb, like I'm in the womb, and that's when happiness, contentment, and fulfillment was 100% there. Maybe it wasn't even there. Maybe the womb was troubling. Maybe it was whatever. I'm trying to find when happiness heard our name. And when was that moment that inspired us to come back to it? Or rather, when did it start chasing us? when did it first hear our name? And when did it start chasing us? Get what I'm playing with here?
I think I get what you're playing with.
Cool. Any ideas in regard to that?
To me, it refers to the fact fundamentally that we have forgotten or mistaken our essential nature. And as such, we're on this path unknowingly through the ego. We're trying to use the ego to get back to happiness, but we're just using it through this illusory mechanism called the ego. And we're trying to basically bypass the direct path of recalling or just remembering who or what we are. So rather than just turning inward to quote, running through the streets trying to find you, that to me is outward running, looking for all kinds of activities, relationships, events, snorting, mom's nipple, whatever the fuck it is, that we're eventually being challenged at some point to come back and look inward versus outward to answer the fundamental question. To me, it's like, we did a bunch of Journeys of Wisdom classes. It would be John challenging people to say, referring to Carl Jung around individuation, right? Becoming less codependent. He would challenge us to say, can we see ourselves in the other? And if you can, then that would be the beginning of lessening this idea of a separate self, my interpretation, that I'm not separate from you. Fundamentally, our nature is a shared nature. So to bridge the gap, maybe, so to speak, with some of our mutual trainings that we've participated in together. So that's how I'm looking at that. And maybe it may or may not help. I would just say when someone becomes aware of their interdependence, their individuation, maybe from a psychological term, that's the closest thing to non-ego, doing things out of a place of non-ego, right? Activity that is non-egoic based. To go back to our earlier comment, because I think there might be a relationship there to consider. So maybe not.
Yeah, absolutely. This is interesting. We're probably not even halfway through this chapter, so I just want to check in with you and see what you think we might consider around completing this and when.
Well, we can pick it back up. We can run it. Okay, so we can just, all right, so we have 10 minutes left to get through a couple more pages, so we can either highlight it and just throw some ideas. We can hit the pedal to the metal.
Yeah, let's make it through the next section to the vanishing of the illusion.
Okie dokie.
So, because I still have a fair amount of notes even up until that point, so I'll make a mark that we'll stop there and restart on our next one on page 94. But I wanted to ask you about grace, because I'm not super familiar with like the religious approach to what grace means. Are you familiar with that?
Being born and raised a bloody Catholic.
I mean, I was born and raised Catholic too, but I fucking blocked that shit. I think that's a little bit more with like traditional Christian, no?
Yeah, I mean, typical Christianity uses the word grace, I think, a lot more than probably Catholics. In my experience, I went to parochial school and all, so.
I went to a Catholic high school. I don't remember grace very much.
Yeah.
That dirty grace bitch.
Yes. Yeah. What are you asking for in light of this conversation where we're at?
I'm saying in the lens of Christianity, do you know what grace means?
Grace, in my experience, is simply that you were bestowed upon yourself outside of your doing and outside of what have been the outside of the probable consequences of your decision making, that somehow that there was a phenomena where you didn't do anything to achieve anything, but you've been bestowed upon this graceful compassion and forgiveness and etc.
Okay, so what I think I heard was not based upon your doing. You have been gifted, graced with a sense of forgiveness, fulfillment, reverence.
Yeah, maybe there's the concept of serendipity and synchronicity in this,
Okay.
where there's this idea that shit just happened, and it's a random act of kindness.
Okay.
In some theoretical sense. You didn't deserve it because you're a sinner fundamentally,
Okay.
and you're going to be bestowed a graceful, grace, so that you can have an opportunity to turn away from your sins and be forgiven.
Yeah. So do you think that enlightenment is something that you work towards and choose, or is it based more upon the Christian sense of grace, like poof, it happened?
Yeah, I don't, I would say historically, I would say you worked your ass off to obtain a state of enlightenment, and you did all of those things to arrive at a space. I would say that's evolved into grace is just something that shows up on the doorstep. And there is I would say on some level, there is a relationship where you become receptive to that knock on the door. Outside of before, you were ignoring, or you had earphones in and you couldn't hear the knock, right? So the earphones would be synonymous with activity, the egoic activity that we've been talking about. So now the headphones somehow are either dimmer in volume, or one earbud is out and you hear the knock on the door and you finally answer it.
Yeah. The more I continue to play with these, especially Rupert, like this book, David Hawkins' work, yeah, man, it just really has continually invited me to play with allowance, surrender, less doing, I don't know if passivity is the right word, but like just relaxing into what this is more with these works. You know what I mean? Is that a similar experience for you? You don't need to validate me, but does it feel like more or less work to you?
Thanks for parenting me all over the place, Tyler. I would say is Alan Watts makes a good, I always love this analogy where he says the ego is associated with muscular tension in the body. It shows up in the body as muscular tension. So I always like that phrase. So for me, when one becomes rigid, tight, that to me is synonymous with egoic activity of resistance, psychological resistance, we'll just say in the moment. And that is different from being relaxed, receptive, open, a womb, call it the yin yang phenomena as well, whatever other mental models we want to pull into this conversation.
Yeah. By the way, I just started listening to an audiobook of Alan Watts. I think it's just a lecture series, In Your Mind, or In My Own Mind.
Out of Your Mind.
Out of Your Mind.
Yeah, that's the name of the book.
That's not the name of the book. It's the lecture series.
Okay, well, he's got the book titled, I'm looking at it, Out of Your Mind by Alan Watts.
Show it to me.
Okay. I'll prove and defend.
Fucking liar. Oh, I wonder, is it based on the lecture series? Anyways, I just started listening. I've listened to like some Alan Watts on YouTube and stuff, but I just started listening to this lecture series on Audible, and it's fucking blowing my mind, dude. I feel like with Rupert's work, David Hawkins, Alan, there's probably somebody else that I'm missing there, but like oh, it is just such a non-dual explosion of jizz all over the place.
Always bringing it back to your dick, Tyler.
Quote me on that one. Non-dual explosion of jizz.
Right.
Anyways,
that should be the fucking title of this fucking chapter.
All right, so finishing up with grace. You fuck.
Yeah.
Wait a second. Don't you speak yet. Okay, yeah. Let me read this if you don't mind. Do you mind?
I will give you permission since you were asking and you said that that was a requirement for non-ego activity. So, okay, please go ahead.
Oh yeah, my ego's right here, baby. Right here. So happiness is the nature of awareness. Suffering is the activity of the ego. Seeking and resisting are the defining characteristics of the separate self or ego. And therefore, the ego is always trying to escape from its current experience into the past or future. Thus, the ego considers the now to be the cause of its suffering. Therefore, it is always trying to avoid it. And the next just quick line is, the ego is at war with the now. And then he begins to talk about like how looking into the future creates anxiety, looking into the past creates depression or disappointment, and so on. I think this is really important to see and to relax into like present moment awareness. Like if you're just considering meditation, like people using meditation practices, the power of now, and all these things to come back into the experience of nowness. If there can be some understanding about like the feelings, the experiences of anxiety, this is really common now, or depression, super common now, as that being an expression of your separate self, for some reason not wanting to look at the right now, it might allow for a little bit more ease in the experience of those difficult times. Yeah, that's what I found. Regress that.
Word up, word to the mother. So, question for you.
Does he say why the ego rejects the now? I mean, obviously, based on what we know, it's like, well,
I would propose that the ego would reject the now is because it has beliefs and conditioned responses that sees the now as an existential and literal threat for its survival, i.e., the sensations of being overwhelmed, the sensations of a loss of control.
Okay. That's interesting because, yeah, as every experience happens in the now, all of our difficult experiences happen in the now. We associate the possibility of a difficult experience happening in the now. So we avoid the reality of every experience, both good and bad, happening in now. So we actually negate the possibility of bliss right now because of the fear of what else could happen right now, which is trauma.
Yeah, and remember, I think we've been exposed to the idea that we feel safer in our dysfunction than the uncertainty and the unknown of what could be quite functional, right? I mean, familiarity breeds content. So, you know, whatever feels normal and safe and predictable, even if it's dysfunctional as fuck,
yeah,
we're going to choose that over the joy and the bliss that you were just referring to, or the potential for it, because it's too risky, right? And so, I mean, how many times have you in this conversation, or have I, or when you're working with a client, how fast do they think they're in the present moment, but what they're really speaking is an age-regressed little boy or girl giving an opinion to a question or an interpretation about something.
Yeah.
We think of it as being the present moment adult self, but I know for me, if I pay attention, I have certain one-liners and beliefs that show up in my language that when I sit back and consider it, I'm like, that's just my 8-year-old. That's a belief that I've had since I can remember as being synonymous with 8 years old, that I can recall to the best of my ability in this moment. So although I'm 41 and I think I'm answering someone's direct question, I'm really in that moment metaphorically and emotionally. Boom, I'm immediately slipping right into an 8-year-old emotional state, sharing that. And then I come back to quote the present moment, and I flow in and out of this age regress current state, age regress current state habitually.
Can you notice a difference in tone in your voice when you shift into now and past?
A lot of times, probably not all the time. So I'll leave myself a little rope to be flexible with.
Yeah, sure. I would imagine that. Well, I noticed this with certain people; they'll actually sound very childish. But what I was thinking about with you is that New York accent. I would imagine that probably when you slip into the past in some way, you probably have that accent a little bit more, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a good example. Like when there was certain parts of me that at times when I was challenging you, it was totally the New Yorker in me. Like I could fucking wake up, Tyler. Don't you fucking get it? Let's go, dude. It's fucking makes one-on-one. Like, so in my house growing up, it was my stories of, it was always challenged. Everyone needs to be challenged and fucking jabbed.
Yeah.
And that's how you get your point across. That's how you win debates. That's how you win discussions. Is you get assertive. Because we were a holler, maybe stereotypical, but we were a hoot and a holler of a family. Like we argue, really argue. And 5 minutes later, we might be playing together. I mean, it wasn't like, for the most part, hey, let's go down to the park. Let's go shoot. That we got that off our chest. Okay, cool. Let's go.
Yeah, it's very. You are Italian, right? That's pretty Italian. That's at least from my experience of it.
I'm a mutt, so yeah, I have some of that. I have a lot of Western European, like Irish, English, Scandinavian. I got 10% black. I got South Western African. That's why I have a big ass. That's why I joke with myself until I went, because I have a little bit of African in me.
Wow. Just killing it over here. I now I know. I thought it was all the squats you do, but it actually has nothing to do with the work you put into the gym.
Yeah, well, it's maybe a combination of the two, right? Since powerlifting, since I was 15 or 16 years old.
No.
Yeah.
No, see, when I'm working hard with my ass because I'm just a stick, right? So from a stick going to having an ass, like it's pretty clear. Like dude's doing some squats, doing some lunges.
Do you think you have an ass?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Now I do, but it goes away quick. Like I'm not doing those lower body exercises, and this is very relevant to the conversation. So yeah, I think that we pretty much wrapped up that section. We'll leave it here midway through page 94. We'll leave off at the Vanishing of Illusion. I knew this was going to be a big chapter. I didn't realize we were not going to get even halfway, maybe halfway through.
Well, we got a couple of pages left, homeboy. But whoa, big boy.
We're going to be, and I never thought this would be the case either, but this little book is taking many weeks, but it's rich stuff, and I don't have a problem with it. I think it's important that we dissect, divest, play with all the aspects of it.
I concur. That's why I enjoy showing up with you every week.
Cool. Well, brother, and Instagram and YouTube, thank you all again for being here week 7. Hopefully we confused you. Hopefully you confused yourself, because confusion is a good place to be. What do you think?
it can be a good indicator, or it could be a facilitation of just more confusion.
Cool.
Which could be a good indication too. So who knows? I don't know. To each his own.
Yeah, for sure. All right, brother. All right, everyone.
Cheers.
Peace out. Happy weekend. Bye-bye.